Right. So we've been going through the book of Romans this summer, and now we've come to chapter 12. Romans is one of those books that it's worth really reminding yourselves of where you've gone so far. What has Paul done? What has he said to get to each place? Because it is such a densely packed book. And so we're going to just take a quick look at what's happened in chapters 1 through 11, at least a broad overview, because we're going to find that it's going to help us make a lot more sense of what we just heard. And as we said, I'm guessing at the beginning of this summer, introducing the book of Romans, is that Paul is writing for one primary reason and one kind of secondary reason. And he is addressing the Christians, followers of Jesus in the city of Rome, particularly because they have had trouble coming together as a unified group, because on the one hand you have Jewish followers of the Jewish Messiah, Jesus, and on the other hand you have Gentile followers of this Jewish Messiah. That may not seem like much, but that's a huge difference. And historically, we know that there was a period of time before this letter was written, and I think that this was part of the reason that Paul had to address this, because the Jewish people, ethnically Jewish people living in Rome, were removed. They were kicked out by the Roman emperor. And it was several years later that they were able to return. So on the one hand, you've got Gentile Christians, followers of the Jewish Messiah, who have now been living on their own, practicing their faith for several years, and then you have the Jewish followers of the Jewish Messiah returning to their home city, and now they've got to get along. And when you've got, especially like the Jewish followers of Jesus who have a much deeper connection to the history of Israel, and the Gentile Christians who are kind of new to this, it's impossible for there not to be any friction. And the parallel that I drew at the beginning of the summer was that imagine if we have like St. Paul's here, American Christians, and then we received into our congregation a group of people formerly living in the Middle East and supporting ISIS rule, who have been reformed, repented, and come to Jesus and are now part of our community. That would be amazing, but let's not kid ourselves at how difficult and complicated that would be. So on the one hand, Paul is addressing how these two groups, which are incredibly different, can come together. And then the secondary reason is that he seems to sense that there is political problems ahead. He addresses this issue of suffering in the faith, suffering for Jesus, because many scholars think that he is sensing that the tides are about to turn on the Roman imperial level. And it turns out he's right. Emperor Nero is kind of the first who did the whole state-sponsored persecution of Christians. Paul, the author of this letter, will die under Nero's reign. So he's kind of sensing that something is going to be happening, and he wants to prepare people for that. So Paul's method for bringing these two groups together is brilliant. I mean, if we had, two very different groups together and they're having a hard time living in community, it would make sense, as Paul does, to first build a case to explain why everybody is on equal playing field. Because on the Jewish side, these are the people of the covenant. That 2,200-ish years before the time of Jesus, God made this covenant. It's a lot like a marriage, saying that his descendants, who became the Israelites, who became the Jews, will be their people, and he will be their God. He gives them these gifts, the gifts of Torah, the way of living and being in the world in accordance to how God wants. This is a very intimate and very special thing that the Jews have as bearers of the covenant. And yet, their lives together, so to speak, are like a tumultuous marriage that is constantly plagued with infidelity. The Israelites were, as the Bible would say, whoring after other gods, worshiping other gods, while at the same time God remains intensely faithful to the promise that he made with Abraham and his descendants. And so you have the bearers of this covenant, bearers of this promise. They have this history. And while that was all taking place, the Gentiles, people like me, like my ancestors, were probably running around naked, painting themselves blue, and worshiping trees, the Celts of some kind. Just look it up. It's fine. Or not, because that's weird too. And so then you have these Gentiles who are kind of new to all of this. They've adopted this Jewish Messiah. They've come to believe in him. So now, what do we do? And Paul constructs this image of a law court where God, as this just cosmic judge, is pronouncing judgment on humanity. And not judgment in the sense that he's being judgmental, but judgment in the sense of justice, where everybody is in the dock, standing before him, and we're pleading our case and trying to make the case that we are righteous, we do not deserve punishment. And Paul says, guess what? Everybody is guilty. That very famous verse from the book of Romans, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Now, in context, you could translate that pretty easily as, for both have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Both Jew and Gentile, which oddly enough is everybody, all encapsulated into one. Both Jew and Gentile, you are all culpable. You all stand together guilty before a God who brings justice. And you can imagine, granted Paul wrote this, so he didn't get up and preach it to them, but you can imagine Paul maybe standing up before both groups of Jewish and Gentile Christians who are trying to make this work, and he lays out this case that you are all guilty, and then he says, now, anybody really want to argue that you're better than the other? I thought so. There's kind of a satisfying moment when he brings it all together. However, God is described as one who is faithful to the promises that he has made. That even though the people who bore that covenant, the children of Abraham, were not faithful, he is. And in this move that was so surprising that nobody really saw it coming for what it was, he sends his own son to take on flesh, to wear sandals and robes and have eyelashes and eat food and take on the human experience. And it was so startling that people didn't really understand what was happening. And one New Testament scholar says that God acted in a surprising, unforeseen way that shocked everybody, just as he always said he would. Very odd tension. And so Paul says that it was in that moment that he sends his son Jesus, that he reveals how he's going to be faithful to the promises that he made to Abraham, which also include that whatever happens with Abraham's descendants, the entire world will be blessed. An ancient rabbi kind of pondering and meditating on the whole Abraham, but who is preceded by Adam, who fell into sin, kind of imagines God saying that if Adam goes wrong, we will send Abraham. The sense that what happens through Abraham will repair the world. So God made good on his promise. He sends his son Jesus, who takes on this role of Israel. He becomes the descendant of Abraham that that nobody could be. He fulfills everything that what a truly human being should be and do. He is without sin. He is innocent, and yet he goes to his death, the only truly innocent person who dies, but he dies in our place. So as Paul says, as he is working his way towards chapter 12, that imagine now you are again in the docks facing this just judge, this cosmic judge. The case is laid out before you, and you are clearly guilty. And we are all culpable for the sin in our lives. Or another way to put it, we have all contributed to the dehumanization of ourselves and other people. We have violated what it means to be human. The case is laid out. This is not going to go well. And the gavel strikes the bench, and the just judge pronounces us not guilty. You are free to go. Because the innocent man had been pronounced guilty. And in this wild, explosive moment, Paul explains that we have been brought together. Jew and Gentile no longer are separated because it is Jesus who is gathering everyone to himself. Or in modern days, we'd say there is no black, brown, or white. There's no Democrat or Republican. There's no Californian or everybody else, because who cares? Or Orange County in LA. The things that we would use to divide ourselves have no place in the family of God because we are united by Jesus. And so, Paul then says, therefore, in light of all of this, and God's mercies, he calls it in that translation, in light of all of this, you are a living sacrifice. Now, we've got to step briefly into an ancient worldview here. Because a sacrifice isn't just like I'm sorry for my sins, so I'm going to kill that animal and then be done with it. No, a sacrifice is a two-way street. You take the animal and its blood is drained from it and it is placed on the altar and it is burned. And you'll find this actually in the Old Testament a fair amount. The idea that God shares a sacred meal with you. When you make this sacrifice, the smoke rises up and rises to the heavens, and it's like he breathes it in. That's his part. And then the meat, at least most of it, is handed back to you, and you take part in a sacred meal. But this time, Paul is saying, you're the living sacrifice. A living sacrifice crawls off of the altar. In other words, there is something as the praises and love of his people rise up to him, but then he sends us out into the world to take place in this sacred meal. A living sacrifice is a reference to what we do and who we are in the world. Now, we are going to skip the rest of that paragraph and go down to the rest of it, and then we're going to come back. Did you notice that if Paul lays all of this out and says, this is the amazing, incredible, surprising thing that God has done in our world. He has entered into our humanity and defeated sin and death itself. That then he lists out a series of traits and postures of being towards your fellow human beings that sounds incredible. Could you imagine what life would be like if everybody sought to live for the benefit of everyone else? Who would make a point to not live selfishly, to live for your better good, to not seek revenge, to overcome evil with good, that when somebody comes and harms you or whatever, does injustice, that rather than getting revenge, you seek for their good too. Imagine how much better life would be if we did this in our marriages, in our relationships, if we did this at work, if this is how our culture truly lived. Imagine if we took Romans 12 and laid that out as the rubric by which we expect our elected officials to live and work. I mean, I got to be honest, would we have any elected officials left? I think statistically there's got to be one guy from somewhere that's pretty decent. It's a nice cynical comment from me. But I think that's the point. We don't do it. As good as that would really be to live like that, we either don't do it or we do it very imperfectly. I really struggled with this message, and when I was talking to a good friend of mine and colleague about it, I kind of came to realize, like, oh, this is one of those messages that I call hypocritical sermons, because I've got to preach on something I'm not really all that good at. And that's not a false humility thing. I struggle. I can be incredibly selfish, and so can you. It's hard not to want to hurt the person that hurt you. It's hard to take the gifts that God has given you and do them with mercy and justice, to give generously, to lead diligently, to conduct yourselves in wisdom among your fellow people. We don't do it. And I myself can get very cynical when I think about this. By a strange twist of fate or history or whatever you want to call it, yesterday we got a really dark reminder of just how bad we can get. I'm talking about the rally in Virginia. I mean, when I first heard about it, I was like, really? Well, white supremacists in Virginia. Like, and now there's a body count? It's 2017. Are we not beyond that? The answer is no. And for me, the cynic, I find myself getting down. I mean, I look at the ways that we treat each other. I look at the way I treat other people, how I can be very selfish. And if you don't believe that, ask my wife, or not, because she's not here, thank God. But we have this problem where Paul says, this is who we are and this is what we do. And we go, if you're a cynic like me and it's a real struggle, all I can see is how I don't measure up. Which is why I think Paul began this chapter in the first paragraph with also, do not conform to the world. Because conforming to the world is buying into the lie that humanity is terrible and has no hope and will not get better. That the only point of life is to just get what you can, enjoy what you will, until you die and you're buried and you turn to dust and then you're gone. The world says it's not really possible to get better, but maybe we can mitigate the symptoms. The world says that, of course, there's a fascist, white supremacist rally in Virginia because that's just what we do. But Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Be transformed because the things that he has talked about are actually possible. That we live now in 2,000 years of history where people have taken very, very seriously everything that he has laid out in the book of Romans so far, and have taken that so seriously they have actually sought to live in the ways that we have heard read. And I find that is like food for my soul. That is a way that God can renew my mind by remembering that even though we have a checkered past and we gain nothing by ignoring it, Christians have for 2,000 years made a point to enter into the darkest moments of human history. That the civil rights movements 60, 70 years ago were predominantly Christian. A good friend of mine who's now well in his 70s, when he was at seminary, told us a story, and this guy is like whiter than white, of getting chased by the KKK in Arkansas because he was taking part in rallies for civil rights. I remember a couple years ago when there was the Ebola epidemic that taking place in Western Africa. And there were a couple of journalists that wrote in a very frustrated way because all of the Americans that were involved in treating and helping the patients with Ebola and helping to stop the progression of this epidemic were doing so because they were Christians and their faith compelled them to help. That the Americans that fought Ebola on U.S. soil were Christians, suffering because they felt prompted by the Spirit to care for others. You might have heard about the modern slavery movements and involved with human trafficking and the like. There are very large and complex organizations that are specifically in place to combat human trafficking, and they're predominantly, if not overwhelmingly, Christian. I went to a conference on human trafficking. It was not religious in any way, but I found it funny because you could tell every single one of the presenters and people running this organization were part of parachurch organizations. Our history is not quite so bleak. That maybe when Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, he is giving us this promise that the Spirit will burn away the cynicism that inevitably collects, because that is what we are bombarded with. Because we actually belong to a family that is unified as one single body under Jesus himself, that has actually taken seriously everything that God has done and the charge that God has given us, that it is in fact possible by the power of God's Spirit to live and move within ourselves and within our communities and take seriously the fact that rather than God demanding we construct a ladder and climb up to him through ridiculous religious works, that God is the God that has come to us and saved us. And if he has saved us from ourselves, he has saved us for not just the renewal of our minds, but of the earth as well. You are living sacrifices, crawling off the altar, sent by God, united by Jesus, to touch and transform the darkest parts of our world. And lo and behold, if you know our history, it has happened, and it continues to happen. Sometimes in big ways, and sometimes in ways that you won't know until 20 years later. May we here at St. Paul's have that cynicism that comes from living in our world burned out of our hearts, that we will be transformed and renewed because of everything that God has done, and that by everything that God will do and is doing in us and through us. We live as one body, and the things he has charged us with are actually possible by his Spirit. Amen.